Hello, everyone, and welcome to Office Hours. I'm Stuart Newsome, and today's session is called When Revenue Cycle Becomes a Daily Battle. Now, today is going to be a little different from our usual format. Normally, I would have a guest with me, ask a series of questions, and let the conversation develop from there. Today, it's just me, but I still don't want this to feel like I pulled a string and started talking for the next 20 minutes. So, I'm going to frame the discussion around several questions that revenue cycle leaders are wrestling with right now. So as we move through them, I'll share some of the comments, some of the concerns and patterns that we've been hearing from clients, prospects, and other leaders in the field. The idea for today's conversation came from a comment made by a healthcare executive recently at the Infinix Healthcare Revenue Cycle Thought Leadership Executive Forum. Now, I'm not going to repeat the exact analogy that was used, but the point was simple. This leader wanted revenue cycle to become dependable enough that it did not require daily executive attention. And that stayed with me. Not because revenue cycle should be easy. It's not easy, right? Anyone who has spent any meaningful time in this field knows how complicated it actually is. We're dealing with payer rules, prior authorization, documentation, coding, claims, denials, appeals, patient responsibility, staffing, technology, and a seemingly endless number of exceptions. Complexity is just part of the work, but instability does not have to be. And there's a difference between managing a complex revenue cycle and fighting the same revenue cycle battles every single day. There's also a difference between an occasional operational issue and an operating model where leadership must continually check, chase, escalate, and intervene. That is the distinction I want to explore today. So let me start with a question. Where in the revenue cycle does leadership still have the check, chase, or intervene? Now think about one specific area. Maybe it's AR, maybe it's prior authorization. It could be denials. It could be your charge capture. It could be your coding. It could be your patient estimates, or a vendor relationship, right? That seems to require more oversight than it should. One comment we are hearing from leaders out there is that they feel like they're involved in everything because they're never sure which problem will affect cash next. That's a very honest response. And I suspect it would sound familiar to more than a few people listening. Now, when leadership is involved in everything, it usually does not mean every single issue is equally serious. It often means that the organization does not trust the system to distinguish what is serious from what is routine. So, whichever issue is loudest gets the attention, right? Squeaky wheel gets the oil. A backlog appears, cash slows, a payer issue begins showing up, a vendor escalates a concern, someone schedules a meeting, the team shifts its focus, performance improves for a while, so leadership moves to the next priority, and then the same warning sign appears again. And that pattern reminds me of a recurring check engine light. The light comes on, you take the car in, and then someone looks at it, clears the code, and tells you to keep an eye on it. Yeah, keep an eye on it. For several days, everything seems fine. Then the light comes back on. And after that happens a few times, your concern changes. You're no longer asking only what does the light mean today? You begin asking, can I trust this vehicle to get me where I need to go? And can I trust the person that told me just keep an eye on it? Revenue cycle leaders experience the same shift. It's not simply that cash slowed once. The concern is whether cash will remain predictable after leadership stops watching it so closely. It's not simply that a denial category increase. The concern is whether the response will continue after the immediate attention fades. It's not simply that work became stuck. The concern is that the leadership had to discover it before the workflow responded. And that's where an operational problem begins to become a trust problem. Once trust declines, oversight usually increases. Leaders ask for more reports. They schedule additional meetings. They request frequent updates. They begin reviewing operational details that would normally sit several layers below it. That response is understandable. But when something feels unstable, we watch it more closely. But there is a cost to that. Every hour an executive spends trying to determine why claims are not moving is an hour that person is not spending on growth, strategy, organizational policy, or priority. Revenue cycle has always mattered to the executive team. So I just want to make that clear. The problem is when it becomes part of their daily operational workload. The other challenge is that the constant intervention can hide the actual weakness. So when leadership steps in, things often improve. Priorities become clear, decisions happen faster, the vendor assigns more experienced people, old accounts receive attention. Everybody knows somebody important is watching. Amazing how that happens, right? But when the executive attention leaves, the old conditions may return. And that tells us the organization has proven it can improve performance. So that's a good thing. What is not proven is that that improvement can sustain itself. So here's the next question. How do you know when an issue is no longer temporary and has become a deeper operational problem? Well, one concern that comes up in our conversations that we have with healthcare organizations, and they state that the individual departments seem to be doing their jobs, but the work still gets stuck between them. And that is a great observation because it gets to one of the most common sources of instability. The people may not be failing, but the handoffs may be failing. Billing may complete its task, coding may complete its task, the clinical team may respond when asked. That's amazing. The vendor may meet its individual service level requirements, right? According to the contract, yet the claim still does not move. That can happen when everyone owns a part of the process, but nobody owns the outcome. So I'm going to come back to that word a little more often, outcome. An authorization might be missing documentation. The authorization team requests it, and the clinical office believes the request was sent. So the file reaches a shared inbox. Someone assumes another team member has picked it up. The procedure date actually gets a little closer, and everyone involved may have completed one reasonable action, but the patient is still at risk for delay. The same thing can happen for denials. The denial is categorized, it's routed correctly, the appeal team receives it, the root cause may even be identified. Imagine that. But if no one connects that denial back to the front end workflow that created it, well, then more claims continue entering the cycle with the same defect. So the organization becomes efficient at processing the consequences without preventing the cause. Normal validation happens in every revenue cycle. I should say normal variation should happen in every revenue cycle. But cash may fluctuate because of timing. Volumes change. A payer processes a batch later than expected. A key employee leaves. A new system rollout causes a temporary slowdown. One difficult week does not mean the operation is broken. But repetition matters. If the same problem keeps returning after it has supposedly been fixed, well, that deserves closer attention, right? Dependence on extraordinary effort matters too. So when results improve only after a leader joins the meeting, a consultant is brought in, or a vendor executive becomes involved, the underlying workflow may not be strong enough to manage itself. So a gap between activity and outcomes is another warning again. It's another warning sign. This one can be difficult because activity reports often look measuring. Accounts are being touched, calls are being made, tasks are being completed, productivity appears strong, yet cash remains delayed. Aging increases, denials are categorized but not resolved. Work moves from one queue to another without getting closer to payment. Now, does that sound right? Activity is not the same as progress. A claim can receive several touches and still be no closer to resolution. An authorization can move across multiple queues while the procedure date continues approaching. A denial can be logged, routed, and discussed while the same root cause keeps generating more denials. So sometimes an operation becomes very busy without becoming more stable. It can even become highly efficient at moving unresolved work around. Another clue is the number of workarounds. Speaking of workarounds, a payer changes a behavior, so someone builds a spreadsheet. How many of y'all been there? A report lacks detail, so another manual review is added. A backlog grows, so a temporary team is created, right? A vendor is not providing enough insight, so more meetings are scheduled. Each workaround may help, but the problem is that temporary responses have a way of becoming permanent. A year later, the organization may be relying on several side processes that were never designed to work together. The original problem remains, but now the team has also inherited a more complicated operating model. And that is often when leaders hear, this is just how we do it here. I wish I had a dollar for every time I heard that. The sentence should get attention. It may mean the workflow depends on institutional memory rather than a dependable process. So let's move to another question on that. Do your dashboards help you decide what to do next? Or do they mostly tell you what already happened? Now, when we talk with revenue cycle leaders about reporting and visibility, we often hear some versions of this. And I quote, we have so many reports that the real problem is figuring out which one deserves attention. We hear that all the time. And that is a very common challenge. Most organizations do not lack data. Revenue cycle teams have reports for cash, AR, denials, prior authorization, eligibility, coding, productivity, clean claims rates, payer performance, and dozens of other measures, right? So the problem is often not seeing the information. It's knowing what the information means operationally. So a dashboard may tell you AR over 90 days increased, and that matters. But can it tell you why it increased? Can it show whether the increase is concentrated in one payer? How about, can it distinguish a documentation delay from a follow-up problem? Can it tell you whether the inventory is truly new or the return of an issue everyone thought was resolved? Can it identify who owns the next action? This is where visibility often stops short of control. Leadership sees the warning signs, but still cannot determine what should happen next. So another meeting is scheduled. Someone asks for more detailed report. A team member downloads information from a different system. The vendor sends another spreadsheet. People spend time reconciling numbers before they can even discuss the problem itself. And by the time the organization agrees on what happened, more days have passed. A stable operating model connects a signal to a response. When an exception appears, someone should understand what it means. The organization should know whether it requires immediate action or can be handled within the normal workflow. A clear owner should be able to investigate without waiting for the issue to reach an executive meeting. And that does not mean the dashboard needs to be provided the answer to every situation. Revenue cycle work still requires judgment, but the reporting should narrow the question, not be the answer to the question. There is a meaningful difference between saying AR is getting worse and saying something like commercial payer claims from 2 locations are aging because medical records are not reaching the follow-up team within the expected time frame. The broad metric creates concern. The operational detail creates direction. And there's another risk with reporting. Sometimes the dashboard becomes a substitute for a difficult conversation. The numbers are presented, performance is described as improving, and everyone moves to the next slide. But the underlying process may still be unstable. And that is especially important when external partners are involved. A vendor may accurately report that productivity increased. It does not necessarily mean cash improved. A vendor may show that accounts were worked within the service level agreement, and that does not tell you whether the right accounts were prioritized. The report may technically be correct and still fail to explain the operational realities. The question is not simply whether the dashboard is accurate. The question is whether it helps the organization understand what is changing and what is being done about it. So I want to stay with the reporting for a moment and ask a related question. Have alerts, dashboards, and additional monitoring made the operation more controlled, or have they sometimes created more noise? Teams that have added layer after layer of monitoring often describe the result this way. We have added more alerts, but now the team is overwhelmed and important issues can get lost in the noise. How many of you feel that way? Now that's a real risk. When an organization experiences instability, the natural response is to add another checkpoint, another report, another notification, another meeting, another required field. And the intent is good. The organization wants to make sure that the problem is not missed again. But every additional alert competes for attention. If everything is urgent, nothing truly is prioritized. A team may receive dozens of exceptions in a day without any clear distinction between something that needs immediate action and something that can wait. Managers then become the human routing system. They spend their time reviewing alerts, deciding what matters, and reminding others to follow up. That's not operational control. That is manual supervision layered on top of technology. A useful alert should answer a few basic questions like, what is this different from normal? What could happen if no action is taken? Who should receive it? What is the person expected to do when they receive it? If the alert cannot support those decisions, it may simply be another warning light. So the goal is not to remove visibility, it is to make visibility meaningful. So a stable workflow does not surface every variation to leadership. It manages routine variation at the appropriate level and escalates the issue that genuinely creates risk. And that protects executive attention. It also protects the team from alert fatigue. So when people receive too many signals, they begin relying on experience to decide which ones can be ignored. And that may work for a while, especially when the team includes several long tenured employees, but it creates another dependency. The operation begins relying on the judgment of a few people who know which alerts matter and which ones do not. If those people leave, the organization loses more than an employee. It loses the unwritten operating logic of the process. Here is a harder question. Where has trust broken down in the revenue cycle? It could be trust in the data. It might be confidence in the workflow. Perhaps it's trust in a partner. Maybe the executive team no longer believes performance is truly under control. One of the clearest concerns we hear from revenue cycle leaders is this. Our vendor reports strong productivity, but we cannot connect that activity to better financial results. And that isn't an important distinction. A vendor may be doing exactly what the agreement asked them to do. They may be working the required number of counts. They may be meeting turnaround expectations. Maybe they're also documenting every action. But if the organization cannot connect that work to movement, resolution, or cash, the relationship will eventually lose credibility. Trust does not require perfect performance. No internal team or external partner will deliver perfect results every single month. It's just impossible. Trust comes from being able to explain what is happening honestly. A trusted partner should be able to say where work is accumulating. They should be able to explain why it's not moving. They should identify emerging risk before the client discovers it through a decline in cash. They should also be willing to discuss where their own performance is falling short. A polished report is just not enough. The organization needs an operational story, like what changed, what caused it, what is being done. How will both parties know whether the response worked? Trust gaps rarely begin with one dramatic failure. They usually build through smaller experiences. A report arrives late. A number cannot be explained. A backlog is discovered only after it affects cash. A payer changes behavior, but the pattern is not recognized until denials accumulate. A vendor identifies a problem but does not escalate it until the client asks. Now, each event may seem manageable on its own, but together they change how leaders behave. They ask for more evidence. They create new checkpoints. They involve themselves in lower level decisions. Oversight increases because confidence has declined, but added oversight does not automatically restore trust. Trust returns when the operation becomes understandable and dependable. Leaders should be able to ask where work is stuck and receive a clear answer. They should know who owns the next action, and they should understand whether the issue is isolated or recurring. They should know what happens if the work does not move within the expected time frame. Those expectations should apply to internal teams as well. So sometimes leaders place more scrutiny on an outside vendor than they place on their own fragmented workflows. That's very common. The partner may own follow-up, but the internal team may own documentation. The partner may be responsible for authorization submission, but the clinical schedule may change without reaching them or even being notified. The vendor may own denial bills, but the front end defect continues generating the denial. Why is that? So revenue cycle performance is shared across many people as well as systems. And I know we're all in silos, and that even makes the matter worse. Shared responsibility, however, should not become vague responsibility. Each party should understand what it owns and how it contributes the effects to the final outcome. Otherwise, every issue becomes an argument about responsibility instead of a coordinated response. It's the blame game, and it's pointing fingers instead of true accountability. So let me ask another question. How often does a change in payer behavior become visible only after it has already affected its results? Organizations frequently describe the challenge this way, and I quote, payer behavior changes so quickly that our process is usually reacting after the impact has already started. Now, that's a significant source of instability. A payer may change how it applies a policy. It may begin requesting additional documentation. A denial reason may increase within one specialty. Perhaps an authorization requirement may be interpreted differently. The first few cases may look isolated, and then there's a pattern that appears, and that pattern then spreads. By the time the organization recognizes what is happening, the financial impact may already be very visible. This is one reason looking only at high-level denial totals can be misleading. The overall denial rate may remain fairly stable, which one important category begins accelerating underneath it. The same thing can happen with AR. The total may not look alarming yet, but a specific payer or service line may be slowing down. A stable operation is sensitive to changes in the pattern. It does not wait for every issue to become large. That requires communication across teams, right? So the person working the account may be the first one to notice a new payer behavior. But if that insight remains at the account level, well, the organization loses the opportunity to respond early. The operational model needs a way to turn individual observations into broader intelligence. And that does not require a major committee every time someone sees an unusual denial. It requires a dependable path for surfacing patterns. Someone needs to review them. The organization should then decide whether the issue is isolated, emerging, or significant enough to change the workflow. And this is also where experienced staff add enormous value. They often recognize that something feels different before a dashboard does. The challenge is capturing the insight without making the entire process dependent on one person's memory. So let's turn this toward the practical side. What would have to change for leadership to stop worrying about one part of the revenue cycle? Think back to the issue that we started with. What would make that process dependable? Perhaps the clearest description we have heard from an executive is this: I need the problem to be identified and acted on before it reaches me. And that may be the best definition of stability that we have discussed today. A stable operation does not prevent every problem. It catches problems at the right level. It gives the team enough information to respond. It allows leadership to remain informed without becoming the workflow. Clear ownership is part of that. Every important process needs someone responsible for knowing whether the work is moving, not simply a department listed on an org chart. That needs to be a role that understands the entire workflow well enough to see when the handoff has failed. Escalation also has to be defined. Not every exception deserves executive attention. The organization should know what the team can handle through the normal process, what requires management involvement, and what truly needs to reach leadership. Without those boundaries, everything begins to feel urgent. Teams burn out, executives become numb to alerts. The real risks compete with routine variation. Earlier visibility matters as well, but the goal is not to discover a backlog after it affects cash. The goal is to recognize that work is accumulating differently than expected while there is still time to respond. And that requires understanding flow. How quickly is work entering the process? How quickly is it leaving the process? Where is it slowing down? Is the issue connected to one payer, one location, one specialty, one provider, or one handoff? Well, those questions allow a focused response. The organization does not need to mobilize everyone only when one part of the workflow has changed. Recurring issues also require a different type of review. If the same problem returns, the question should no longer be how quickly can we clear it? The question becomes what continues recreating it? And the answer may be workflow design. It may be a payer change. Perhaps the staffing model does not match the volume. The technology may be routing work incorrectly. The service agreement may reward activity without measuring resolution. I've seen some that are written that way. The cause will vary. But if the review stops when the backlog is cleared, the organization is likely to fight the same battle again. Technology has an important role, but it has to support the workflow rather than add noise. Automation can help identify exceptions. It can route work more intelligently. It can reduce repetitive searching and bring the information needed for a decision into one place. And what it should not do is create another queue that someone must remember to monitor. A new alert does not create stability when nobody owns the response. A dashboard does not create accountability when the workflow remains unclear. So the goal is to reduce the amount of human energy spent checking status, searching for information, and moving work between systems. And that allows experienced people to focus on situations where judgment matters. They can analyze payer behavior, they can work complex exceptions, they can improve the process instead of spending the day rescuing it. And that is what a dependable operating model begins to look like. It's not perfect, it's not free from denials, staffing challenges, or payer friction, but stable means the organization recognizes issues early, responds consistently, and keeps every exception from becoming an executive fire drill. Choose one area where leadership still has to check, chase, and intervene. So this is kind of like a reflection time. Choose one workflow. Then ask yourself, well, what keeps breaking? Do not settle for a broad answer such as AR or denials. Got to be a little more specific. So where does the process actually lose momentum? Is work entering the wrong queue? Is information missing at a handoff? Does a payer requirement change without reaching the team? Is the performance measure encouraging activity without producing resolution? Well, then ask, well, who owns the problem when it appears? Not who receives the report, not who attends the meeting, who is responsible for making sure the work moves. If the answer changes depending on who is in the room, that uncertainty may be part of the instability. And then finally, what evidence would allow leadership to trust the process? Perhaps it's earlier visibility. Maybe it's a clear explanation from a partner. It could be an escalation path that works without executive involvement. The answer should be specific enough that the organization can recognize when confidence is returning. That changes the conversation. Instead of asking, how do we get through this month? The organization begins asking, well, how do we make this process dependable after attention moves somewhere else? And that's the shift from fighting the latest problem to building stability. Now, as we wrap up, the central idea is this. Revenue cycle becomes a daily battle when organizations can no longer trust the operation to remain on track without repeated intervention. The answer is not to eliminate complexity. That's not very realistic. The answer is to build a model where issues become visible before they turn into surprises. Ownership remains clear, and the response does not depend on an executive joining the meeting every time. Take one workflow where leadership is still checking, chasing, and escalating. Ask what keeps breaking, then look honestly at whether the current response fixes the problem or simply quiets the warning light for a while. Thank you for joining me today. Really appreciate your attention. You can find more conversations like this on the Revenue Cycle Optimized podcast. And you can also visit Infinix.com for additional articles, case studies, and insights on all things revenue cycle. Thank you very much.